I'm James Demer, the audio nomad. Today's interview is with Dave Friesema, who is an absolute legend in the in-ear monitor industry. Not many people can say they've been professionally involved with in-ear monitors for over 25 years, and Dave is one of the select few. Today we're going to learn about how he got started in in-ear monitors, how he's influenced the evolution of in-ear monitors over the past 25 years, and we're going to learn what his plans are for his new company, Dark Matter. Let's get into it. I'm just so honored to talk to you. Like, you are really one of just a handful of people that have essentially made a career out of in-ear monitors. Yeah, and I know that you've done other things, but how did you, what was your first sort of musical discovery into IEMs?
So, in the 90s, I was kind of a split person. I'm still a split personality in that I was really into hi-fi and I was really into guitar.
And were you like a teenager? Like what age? And I'm not trying to pin an age on you, but
no, I'm old. I'm an old guy. So yeah, I got into hi-fi kind of right at the end of my teenage years, like 19-ish. Is when I started getting into like serious hi-fi. At least that's how I saw it.
Probably because you had a job and you could afford to buy some stuff, maybe.
Job and no responsibilities is generally what I had a crappy car and a great stereo. That's sort of been a motif in my life.
It's a classic American dream.
Yeah, and a bunch of guitars, and it's always been music. I mean, later on we could go back into the real deep history of it, but it's always been music for me. And I remember first reading about Etymotics even before I worked for Etymotic. In Stereophile, they had these weird, $350, things that went way deep in your ear. I'd never seen anything like them. They called them canal phones. And I was like, first of all, it's a terrible name. You want to talk about scaring your prospective audience, call them canal phones. But anyways, I had heard of them, but I had never heard them. And then, because they're really hard to audition, but I always kind of wanted a pair. And then my sister actually ended up doing the website for a local place, that does IEMs called, they do custom IEMs and hearing protection called Sensophonics for Michael Santucci. They're really well known. Michael is kind of, he's industry royalty as far as a lot of people are concerned, because he's real deep in hearing health protection and, more than selling in-ears, which he does as well. He's always been, he's always really cared about the protection aspect of it, which is important. And he's done a lot of good work. I think he was just honored with an award for it earlier this year. But anyways, she did his site and she got kind of introduced to a lot of that stuff. And she bought me a pair of custom earplugs for Christmas. They use the Etymotic filters and that was a cool thing because I play guitar and obviously being able to protect my hearing would be helpful. So I went there, and while I was there, I said, what the hell? And I bought some sleeves for some ER4s that I didn't even own yet.
And by sleeve, you mean like you had like your impressions and then you had your Etymotics inserted into these impressions of it. They were like sort of custom Etymotics.
I mean, they were basically functional custom tips that you slide onto. There were no modifications to the IEMs, so they're custom tips. So then I bought some IEMs from, if I remember correctly, I got them from Tyle Hertzens, another industry guy. He was at Headroom, and I got to know him over the years. We had a lot of good spirited debates, which were always fun because he's a character and frankly a really nice guy.
Oh, legend.
Yeah, he's great. And I'm not, this isn't supposed to be like the IEM name dropper hour, but, these people were all kind of formative along my path. In fact, Michael Santucci ended up being a reference for me later on when I applied to Etymotic. So,
well, it was a small like community back then. Like, I mean, they're legends now, but at that point it was probably just this sort of like eclectic group of people that were really interested in this very, very specific type of listening device.
Yeah, I mean, Yeah, it was a smaller crowd back then. I mean, I wasn't new to it. I wasn't original to it, I should say. The Air4, I think, got released in 91 or 92. It was the first universal on the market. I got there around 2005. So it was right around the time that the 6 and the 6i were coming out. We were doing a lot of business with the Apple Store and with Apple and things like that. So that was kind of my introduction. I was in Elk Grove, Etymotic was in Elk Grove. It seemed like a perfect fit. I already used their product. I already liked, I was already an audio nerd. I was an engineer, but I didn't really have that type of knowledge. It was kind of abstract and obscure. So I got there and
I'm just going to actually, I want to have you explain for maybe our younger audience or people who are new to the hobby, exactly what an Etymotic is. I know it. You said it's a deep insertion, but what's the driver type? Like, what makes it special?
Yeah, so basically it was the first deep insertion insert earphone. There's been earbuds forever. We all had them growing up, the kind that came free with your Walkman if you're old like me.
Yeah. Kids call them flatheads these days, I think. Flatheads.
I didn't even know that. So that's how old I am. So, basically they came with the Walkmans when I was really young. Then they came with our, portable Discmans when I was in high school and junior high school. And, or actually that was more high school and junior high school. And then, eventually they came with iPods and stuff like that. But those just kind of sit in the intertracheal notch of your ear, the kind of V-shaped part, and they don't really seal in your ear. The thing about the Etymotics is that they actually formed an acoustic seal in your ear. So they would not only provide audio, but they would also protect you from outside noises. And that was one of the main advantages of them, is that you could, you could either be a performing musician on stage, or you could be just, some teenager mowing your lawn and blocking out all the noise and not having to really increase the level of your player in order to hear over, the background noise. And frankly, in those days, the CD players had really wimpy outputs. So, you couldn't get loud enough sometimes, if it was really loud. So this was nice for that. And that's really where we made our name.
And it's a single balanced armature, correct?
Yes. So for the longest time, Etymotic offered nothing but a single balanced armature. And, balanced armatures, for folks that aren't familiar with those, that is, those became popular for the hearing aid industry. They're small. It's a different structure than a moving coil, which is what you normally see in like a hi-fi speaker in your living room, the cone speaker that we've all seen growing up our entire lives. Balanced armatures look more like a little metal can, usually with a little spout on the end. It's different technology. Instead of having the magnet in the back, pushing the diaphragm, it's kind of a U-shaped magnet, and there's a diaphragm, and it goes like this in there, and then there's the spout for the input. And the thing about them is they can get high output in very small sizes, which makes them usable for insert earphones. And they're still the most popular driver type for insert earphones, although, as you well know, there's a lot of other competing types, and that's great. There's a lot of different options nowadays.
And just for the super nerds, were they Knowles or Sonian, or was Etymotic making their own?
Yeah, so originally it was Knowles. So our the founder of Etymotic, was Meet Killian, who used to work for Knowles. He worked on receiver design, he worked on microphone design. We went to Knowles and specifically asked for that driver that eventually became the 23 or the 2689. I don't remember. I might be conflating two different model nut types, but because there's very similar numbers from two different manufacturers. But basically that was supposed to be an exclusive, and it ended up not being an exclusive. There was a little bit of saltiness about that, from what I understand, but I wasn't around for that either. But it was specific. It was originally specifically designed for us from Knowles, and then eventually it just became somewhat ubiquitous in the industry. So people use those all the time. I mean, I use similar drivers to that. You can get basically that identical driver from either Knowles or Sony, and I still use them in designs today because it's still a nice design. I tend to use them more as mid-range only, or mids and highs. I tend to augment them on the low end nowadays, now that I've gone over to the dark side
And I want to talk about your company, Dark Matter, in just a bit. We're going to get through a little bit more of the history of how you got to Dark Matter. What I'm curious about is like the history of the transition from like musician-based, in-ear monitors to going into like the audiophile space. Because it seems like there was a real shift, and I'm not really sure when it happened. I know like Ultimate Ears came out with their consumer 3-driver, 5-driver, and that was probably really competitive with Etymotic. And that seems like that's when the fire was lit in that sort of early to mid 2000, or early 2000 era. Is that right? What's your recollection of that? Like, how did it all happen?
So I think it happened in a couple of stages, and this, I think you'll get different answers from different people in the industry, and you'll probably even get different answers from people at Etymotic. And again, a lot of this happened before I got there, but my take really is that the first time that it really hit kind of overdrive was when Shure came into the business, and I think there was a little bit of competitive feeling between Etymotic and Shure, but the reality is Etymotic, we made a really good product, but we weren't really a household name. And Shure, is and was. And I think that they helped legitimize the category in a lot of ways. Basically once they came out, all of a sudden, more people started asking, what is this? And then of course, Etymotic was more on the consumer side always. We had people use them on stage, but we never really were good at marketing towards that. We were still even trying to figure out consumer because so much of what we did was medical back then. And in the hearing aid space, the company founded itself making audiometric earphones and amplifier chips for hearing aids. Nothing that really could even be remotely called consumer.
Interesting.
And then in the mid 90s, all of a sudden you had Ultimate Ears coming along. They were manufactured by Westone at the time, so it was nowadays it split into 3 companies. Eventually, it became Ultimate Ears, Jerry Harvey, JH Audio, and then Westone. But back then, it was Jerry Harvey and his company Ultimate Ears, and then Westone was involved, and
his wife Mindy, I believe. Right, there was that whole thing.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of that whole thing. So if you talk about too much of it, but
maybe we'll save that for another day. That conversation.
I don't know all of the ins and outs of everything, so I wouldn't want to be inaccurate enough to. It's all hearsay for me. I wasn't directly involved with any of it.
Hey, let's real quick. Can you just tell us what your role was what was your title at Etymotic?
So when I started, I didn't even have a title. I was just. All our business cards just said engineer. It was, wasn't really, it wasn't a title type of place. In fact, I don't think I got a title till our, director of sales at the time basically said, look, I was doing a lot of project management stuff. Even though I came in 2005, by 2007, 2008, I was doing a lot more project management stuff. And eventually I just did all the earphone stuff. And I was working on some design level stuff, although, it would be an insult to all of the really, really smart people to pretend that it was all stuff. In fact, in those early years, I definitely, the heavy lifting was done by others. And over time, I learned how to do my, stuff myself. And that was just because a lot of people there were extraordinarily generous with their knowledge. And it was fundamentally a teaching type place. But I think I got my first title somewhere around, 2010 or 11. Because again, our director of marketing, said, look, Dave is going to trade shows. He's meeting with people at CES. He can't hand out cards that say engineer anymore. So at that point, it became lead engineer or something like that. And then it became eventually, the titles actually ascended after we got acquired by Lucid in 2018, because then I became senior project engineer, and then I became, I think it was senior project lead, then it was, and then eventually I became technical director, and then I was technical director and GM for Etymotic and Westone. So the titles got fancier towards the end, but the work was always fun, even when the titles didn't exist.
I bought my first pair of Etymotics in the late 90s. I remember using them on jobs. I did like all the New York seasons of The Apprentice, and I was using the Etymotic ER4. I can't remember if it was the S or the P. I owned them all. I know there were different like impedance levels and stuff. Curious about like the sort of the product evolution, because I feel like Etymotic was just on fire for a long time, and then maybe never really quite, maybe it missed the train for the multi-driver revolution that happened. Can you tell me a little bit about like, what choices were made as time went on with Etymotic about product development?
Yeah, so I think that depends on who you ask, really. I'm obviously at a point now where I'm designing with multiple drivers, so I'm going to probably give you a different answer than you would get from say, Mead, who was very, very opinionated that you did not need multiple drivers to accomplish what you needed in an IEM. And, a lot of it, I think, really focuses on what design goals you have. And for Etymotic, the design goal was always fidelity and accuracy. As true to the source as you can make it flat was sort of the approach. And, we did a slight modification on that. We started with the Ear 4B, which was basically a binaural earphone, totally flat, diffuse field response. We modified it a little bit for the 4S. Basically, the feedback we got from the field after the B came out was that it was too bright. And that was because most commercial recordings had extra high frequency emphasis added during the mastering process. So there was a study done to figure out what the average high frequency emphasis was, and then the curve was adjusted by that amount. So it was what we call the modified accuracy score.
You were basically undoing what these mastering recording masterers were adding.
Fundamentally, yes. And so the 4S came out, and the 4S was, the most accurate thing on the market. Still pretty much is. I mean, the SR was mildly more accurate, but effectively, all these years later, multiple decades later, it's still the most accurate thing on the market. Now, that's not necessarily what everybody wants, and that's a different argument, but that was always what the goal was of all designs, was to get it as close to the accuracy. We had a target curve, like nowadays there's the Harman curve. We had our own target curve, which was basically derived from Mead's research, taking resonances of the ear canal. During his dissertation, when he was doing studies on high fidelity hearing aids, he put probe mics at the eardrum of a bunch of test subjects and measured the canal response, the acoustic response of people's canals and ears. It's the whole, the diffuse field. It's all, the biology of a human, and basically that average curve became the diffuse field response. Now a bunch of people have done that. It basically, our target curve is basically the same that THX uses for their X curve for movie theaters. A bunch of other people have repeated the research. It's all pretty well vetted at this point. But that modified version of that curve was what our target was. And that was true for anything we made. And, we even had a weighted accuracy score we gave that confused the hell out of everybody else in the industry. But, we had a percentage accuracy, and we did that for years. And, we changed, like you said, there was an S and a P, and the P was basically to address the fact that the portable players at the time really couldn't put off enough output for the 4S to be loud enough. So unless you had a dedicated headphone amplifier, you need more output. So P was a little bit less accurate, but the goal was still that target curve. Mead argued till the end, we never needed more than one driver. And that's why he would, under his watch, there was just not going to be a multiple driver. And, back then we were selling a lot. We got in, again, I think I mentioned it earlier, but we got into Apple stores. We sold, our best years on the consumer side were selling 6i's for folks that, that wanted to pair them with their iPods. And then we did really well with the HF series. So, we had a pretty successful business just running single drivers. Now, the market has changed significantly. I don't think that that's as viable as it used to be. But one thing to keep in mind is back then, there were also very few companies using balanced armatures at all. I could probably count the number of balanced armature earphone manufacturers that use balanced armatures, probably could count them on one hand back then. Yeah. They were expensive, and most people didn't want to deal with that BOM cost and putting things together. Yeah. So it was just a different competitive landscape back then.
Let's talk a little bit about your transition from Etymotic to both ZMF and dark matter. And can you tell me a little bit about, when that happened and, how it happened?
Late in 2020, so in 2018, Etymotic was purchased by Lucid Audio, which is primarily a hearing aid company. I think that it was more than 10 to 1 ratio of our hearing aid business to our consumer electronics business. And that was even after we acquired Westone Audio. So we didn't buy all of Westone, but we bought the earphone portion of Westone. Etymotic had multiple divisions. So, they got the engineers that they wanted for product development across the company. We had a thriving medical division as well. We used to make hearing screeners for hospitals, like for babies, basically otoacoustic emissions testers. It sends 2 tones down the ear canal, and then you can tell based off the reflection off of the tympanic membrane, off the eardrum, you can tell if it's healthy or not. And they would do it at various tones. And it's a way to do a passive hearing test, which is great for babies because babies are not very good at telling you what they can hear and what they cannot. So
that's so innovative. That's amazing.
Yeah, we were the major. None of it was ever released under Etymotic, but we used to make them for, Welsh Allen and Mako and Interacoustics, all of the big medical equipment suppliers. So we OEM'd for a lot of them. I think last I heard it was 10 or 20 million ears had been tested with those. So that was a big business. Lucid ended up eventually cutting that off and selling it. And then, we had acquired Westone, like, again, just the earphone business, but the universal and the custom business. So we moved the custom lab from Colorado down to Texas. And then eventually, after a short time, I was in charge of both Etymotic and Westone. So I was doing that. And then in December of 2023, my position was eliminated, basically. I think they just decided they weren't going to do any in-house development anymore. So they just kind of cut it and moved on. And that was fine. I've met some great people there. As soon as I was done with Etymotic, the first thing I did was talk to Zach from CMF Headphones. Zach and I have known each other for a long time. His business has been growing and growing and growing. And frankly, he just, he was trying to run the business and be the designer, kind of the chief cook and bottle washer. And he just, needed a little bit of help. So I've been doing some acoustic consulting for him, doing some design work for him. He's obviously very capable of doing things on his own, but, an extra set of eyes, ears, and a slightly different skill set is always helpful. So we work pretty well together. So I started doing that, and I'm still doing that. But the other thing I did was I called Tal Kosin, who I think you actually know.
Yeah.
And Tal worked with me back at Lucid. With Etymotic and Westone. Tal was actually my boss there. And I called, we had talked for probably 3 years about wanting to do our own thing where we had more creative control, basically. Because Etymotic and Westone were really, they had very defined fan bases that expected certain things. And, it wasn't super, well, Etymotic was a little boxed in at times. Westone was a little less so, but it was still, it still had its own lineage that we had to kind of be aware of. And we were also operating within the corporate structure as well. So we had kind of wanted to do our own thing. And so I called him, and he was in Japan at the time. And we talked through it. And, he said, okay, we both want to do this, and then let's figure out how. So we spent the next 4 months talking on the phone basically every day, trying to figure out the business plan and how it would work.
Oh, yeah.
And then we founded Dark Matter Audio Labs, which has 4 owners. It's me, it's Tall, it's Zach from ZMF, and it's Sam Roney, who also is he's the owner of and the co-founder of Deconi with Tall. So it's a bunch of industry folks. And then we hired Rochelle Elder, who was the AR person for Westone. So she's now working for us. And then I pulled in somebody who worked for me there as well, named Alex Herrera, who worked in the lab doing a lot of 3D design work and modeling and stuff like that. So basically we put together our team. We decided we're going to make custom earphones. And we basically tried to pull all the best parts that we liked while starting something that isn't trying to recreate the past, something new.
Yeah.
It always starts from that same fundamental place of accuracy that Etymotic started with. I just now take strategic deviations from that. So nothing that we're producing sounds wildly crazy. Like there's nothing really, it's I would consider it all tuned to be a very useful tool, particularly for pro audio, which is really where we're targeting our efforts mostly is, for any job that somebody has on stage, we have something that will serve them well. And unlike some of the other stuff that's pro audio focused, I think they all also sound good with music. There's sort of been this belief that, and you'll hear a lot of musicians say that I have my stage monitors, but they sound terrible for music, but they're a good tool for me. Or I have my audiophile earphones, but they don't work on stage for me. And we're trying to make something that functions in both areas, through sensible design choices, I would say. I'm not great with hyperbole. I'm not great at slogans or anything like that. But, I just feel all our stuff comes from a basis of knowledge.
Yeah.
Okay, so everything is built here in Berwyn, Illinois. Basically, people will either send us digital scans of their ears, or more often than not, they'll send us actual physical impressions. We have a 3D scanner here, so we scan them in, and then we kind of trim and shape them, which is common. This is not unique to us. I'm not pretending that we're doing, recreating anything new here, but this is the process. So, we basically model them in 3D, we trim them, we plumb them, we hollow out the shell, we run the soundboards and stuff like that. Then we print them on, we have a couple of biocompatible material 3D printers, like, the dental and medical grade ones, because obviously these are touching skin, so they need to not cause irritation. So we print them, and then, we have a shop in the back that has grinders and buffers and things like that. So we polish, we do a preliminary polish on them. We clean up the 3D prints, make them look a little bit better, do a preliminary polish, then we install the drivers, then we test them. And then, if everything looks good, we build the faceplates, put the faceplates on, then we test them again. And then we run them through another polish. We do a final test, and then we do just a slight buffing at the end, just so that they look clean as possible before they go in to go. And then I do all the driver matching. We match all the drivers individually, and then we build them into driver packs, and then we pair those up. So we get really tight matches by doing small batch pairing and building that way.
This video is brought to you by Linsoul.com. Linsoul sells IEMs, headphones, amplifiers, digital to analog converters, cables, really just about anything you could want for personal hi-fi or even home hi-fi. Their prices are great, the quality is exceptional, and their customer service is really second to none. Check them out in the link below.